Welcome to the Surviving Siblings podcast. I'm your host, Maya Roffler. As a surviving sibling myself, I knew that I wanted to share my story, my brother's story. I lost my brother to a homicide in November 2016. And after going through this experience, I knew that I wanted to share my story and his story. And it's taken me quite some time to come to the mic to tell it, but I knew it was an important one to tell. So here I am to share his story and mine with you. And it's important that I tell the story of the surviving sibling, the forgotten mourner, the story that is not told enough. So thank you for coming with me on this journey. And now it's your turn to share your stories. We have an incredible guest here today. Her name is Audree Kropen. She is the founder of sibsforever.org. Welcome to the show, Audree.
Thank you, Maya.
I'm so excited to have you here. I was so excited to discover sibsforever.org and you, a fellow surviving sibling. So without further ado, I would love to hear more about your story and the loss of your beloved sister, Robin.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be able to actually tell my story from beginning to end. And it is a long story. I'm going to be 67 years old on September 20th. So a lot of years. I was 12 years old when my 14-year-old sister, Robin, very unexpectedly died. And that really sent my childhood and really my whole life off into a different direction. So in order to really kind of completely understand what happened to me, it's important to understand the family that I was born into. And it was very dysfunctional, although it might not have been apparent from the outside. Appearances were very highly rated. It's the only thing that really mattered. But my parents were emotionally ill-prepared for parenthood. They just weren't set up to be parents, and especially parents to the children that they had. So a little background, my mother was an only child, and she herself had a challenging beginning. And I think this is important to understand. It was very important for me, and it took actually a fair amount of therapy for me to understand how her upbringing really affected the kind of parent that she was. So her mother took her as a toddler from her natural father. They lived right near Detroit, and just sort of upended her, moved her to New York and started a laundry business. And this was back, in the Depression days when starting a business and making a living were very challenging. And in order for this to work for her, she put my mother into like a daycare, night care kind of facility for several years while she got this business going until she eventually remarried. And then she passed off my grandfather, her new husband that she just married, as my mother's natural father. So my mother discovered this as a teenager, and it really upended her life as well. But this early trauma left her damaged in some way, and she was quite damaged. She was very insecure, very narcissistic, really had no concept of what it was like to be a loving parent. I mean, her herself was, she was the only child, and then had this sort of traumatic beginning. So she was abusive physically and emotionally. She would get very upset. Like once we were driving and my sister and I were squabbling and she reached back and she sort of tried to strangle me. And in that same episode, she dug her nail like into my sister's thigh and left this scar that actually never went away. So she was, she was, I would say, had a very bad temper and really was out of control a lot of the time. My father, on the other hand, also not really set up to be a parent either. He had one older sister who was my Aunt May. Her name is May, and she was 4 years older than him, but she always advertised herself as being 4 years younger. And when my father was a teenager, right around 15 or 16 years old, his father died very unexpectedly, just kind of keeled over in the street from a heart attack. And my father took over sort of being the man of the family. He had some financial responsibilities, so he didn't go to college and like my Aunt May did. So he just basically started working at that point, and he continued to work and worked himself to death, really supporting a lifestyle that he never was able to really afford. And so he was always working and always spending more than he was taking in. And he sort of had this secret life. Like when I was growing up, he had his own phone number. And it would ring and he would have these conversations. He had his own post office box. Sometimes people called and they referred to him by a different name. So, he was a mystery. When he died in 1994 at 75, and I went up and kind of poured through his closet, I discovered he really did have quite a secret life that he had never told anybody about. Once when I was in my 20s and he was going through his important papers with me, there, as he was going through, his business papers and birth certificates, there was a divorce decree. I had absolutely no idea that he had a previous marriage. And the reason that he never said anything, really, it was, radio silence, is that my mother didn't want to be known as a second wife. She thought that would be degrading to her to be known as a second wife. So she insisted that he never disclose it or mention it ever, and he never did. So, you can see it was very dysfunctional, insecure parents, very focused on outward appearances, and, anything that wasn't neatly painted into this picture that they wanted to expose, caused them a lot of anxiety. So my sister Robin was on the autism spectrum somewhere. The story predates anything that, all the things that we know about autism today. But she clearly was. She was socially awkward, physically awkward, struggled in school. She was a brilliant musician, though, a piano player. She just had a natural talent for playing the piano. I can still visualize her playing the piano in our living room. It was just amazing. But she was an embarrassing child for them. And since my parents believed that having friends, being socially adept, being popular were the most important things, it was very difficult. And they felt that these things were so important because they wanted to project this perfect American family image. So they didn't understand Robin, and they criticized her, and they pressured her to be somebody that she absolutely just could not be. And so she was very unhappy and very stressed and just not really a happy child. Her awkwardness, and it was, apparent, was hard to cover up. And my parents just couldn't make it disappear as much as they tried, but they pressured her, to have friends. And they would say things like, as you get older, the water would get deeper and you won't be able to make friends. It was unbelievable when I look back at it. At that time, that was all I knew. So, I don't think I was thinking too much about it, but looking back at it, it was pretty horrendous. And because of that, there was just a lot of stress. My father probably didn't really even like my sister. Neither did, his sister Aunt May that I described earlier. They didn't understand her. They didn't have the kind of qualities that they really valued, and they were embarrassed by her. That's the bottom line. My mother absolutely didn't know how to parent anybody, but she was very challenged to parent a child like Robin. My mother herself, as I said, was very narcissistic, and she really needed to be front and center always. She couldn't even be, if you were taking a picture of the family, she couldn't even be on the end.
Oh my goodness, she would stop Audree. That's intense right there.
Yeah, she would stop the picture. She did this multiple times. She would stop the picture and rearrange who was in the picture so that she could be in the middle. So she really was that narcissistic and that intense need. And even with me, she was very competitive. She really needed to be front and center. But with Robin, it was just more than she could do. She just didn't have those skills. So, she just couldn't, parent properly. So me, I was there and, I kind of sat back and I didn't have those problems that Robin did. I had my own set of problems, but I would say I was probably more of a normal, typical child. So I was able to stay out of the pressure spotlight more than Robin was. I didn't really come to Robin's defense. I think, I've had a lot of guilt over the years of not doing that, but in reality, I was only 12 and, through a lot of therapy, I kind of understand that I grew up in this environment and it was all that I really knew. So, I don't have a lot of memories, being playful or close to Robin. Not a lot of good memories of us, being sisterly. I wasn't always very nice. We were kids. So, those memories are there. And there's memories that are lacking that I really wish that I had had. So if there are other surviving sibs listening to this whose siblings died unexpectedly like mine, it's really easy to have your final words or actions with your sibling be sort of not what you wish they would be, and troubling. But the reality is, as I've learned through therapy, that siblings growing up together They fight, they make up, they fight again. A lot of times as you grow into adulthood together, you resolve all those. And, we didn't have a chance to do that. But obviously deep down, we loved each other and that never stopped. So I would say, to really focus on the love and not so much on the specific words or actions that might have happened right before the death.
Oh my gosh, Audree is already dropping some incredible advice for surviving siblings. I mean, only a few minutes in, that's beautiful and so true. I mean, you're telling a story of loss at a very young age, and your sisters only 2 years apart, right? So, I mean, I have sisters, so I know how that story goes, right? So, you don't always get along, but there's a lot of people listening, and I'm sure they're like, oh yeah, I wish I didn't say this, the last time I saw them. So wonderful advice, Audree.
So my sister was 2 years older. She was only one school grade apart. And I think because of the autism-like issues that I described, she repeated kindergarten, a second time. So we were just one school grade apart. And for a lot of times she went to private school. So we didn't really even go to the same school, although that changed. She got a little bit older and we did. So, that's how we grew up. She did pass away when she was 14. She had what we thought was just kind of a normal childhood disease. She was listless, kind of tired, and stayed in bed. Back in those days, pediatricians made house calls, at least ours did. And he did come at least once, but, nobody really thought it was life-threatening. And at 12, I just thought she was sick, and kids get sick, kids get better. I mean, I didn't really think anything much about it.
We hope you're enjoying this incredible episode of the Surviving Siblings podcast. I'm your host, Maya Roffler. We'll be back in just a minute after hearing from our incredible sponsor. Sibling relationships are eternal. Our siblings are such an integral part of who we are. We don't move on when we lose a sibling, although we can eventually move forward. That is why it's essential as surviving siblings to hold on to our sibling memories, stories, and precious moments. Sibsforever.org was created to be your online memory book. It was designed and built by a surviving sibling for all surviving siblings everywhere. It is a secure and private platform for surviving siblings to chronicle memories through storytelling, pictures, and videos. Sibsforever.org is a virtual platform for you, the surviving sibling, to commemorate and honor your sibling relationship. Visit sibsforever.org today to create your free profile and start building beautiful commemorative web pages, including photo and video galleries featuring you and your sibling.
So the night of her passing I was at a play. I was in 7th grade, and I really enjoyed kind of all the drama, aspects of being in school. So I joined the drama club and I tried out for the musical. And so this was the school musical. It was Oklahoma. The day was November 17th. This was 1967. So my sister was born in 1953. So I was very excited. It was the weekend of that performance, and I didn't have a very big part. I had this little tiny dance role in the dream sequence, but I was very excited. So I really wasn't focused very much on Robin, and my last words were something like "bye," and I was out the door for the play. It wasn't anything more than that. During one of the musical scenes, I kind of had this strange quiver and chill, and I do remember I can put myself back there and feel it again. But I was nervous. I didn't really think much about it, but I could still remember that song and feel that chill. And so I had some trepidation, but again, I was excited. It was the play. So when I came home after the play, the house was full of people. It was unbelievable. Some people I knew, some people I didn't. When I opened the door, there was a nurse there. I'd never seen this nurse. She was, dressed in white nursing costume. She opened the door and told me that Robin had died. It was just amazing. It was surreal. So there were people kind of meandering around the house. Some I knew, some I didn't know. They were talking about Robin. They were talking about me. I really felt like I was in a dream sequence. My mother, who was 41 years old at the time, announced to this house full of people that she was going to have another child, just like that. Never had mentioned ever having another child before that I was aware of. My father was 50, 9 years older than her. And he seemed just as surprised by this announcement as I was. She just announced it.
Was she actually pregnant at the time, Audree? I don't know.
No, she just announced that she was going
to happen.
Yeah, that she was going to get pregnant and have another child. So she wasn't pregnant, but this was, her way of dealing with it was that, okay, I'm going to have another child, without without ever talking to anybody, including my father. She just kind of announced it. I'm telling you, it was just really, really bizarre and almost unreal when I think back at it. So, I'm wandering around. I don't know who any of these people are. I don't even know who I am anymore. And she's announcing she's going to, have another child. That was the night. So
who told you, Audree? Who told you? You walked in and you saw a nurse and you saw your house full, but who actually told you that Robin had passed?
The nurse did.
Wow.
When I walked in, a stranger. There was people. Some of them I did know. Some of them were friends of my parents, but some of them weren't. I mean, it was just I didn't even know who I was. So the whole thing was, was so offsetting, and my life changed. Right? I mean, I was this younger child that kind of everything was pretty easy. I was very easygoing. Not necessarily, a hard worker, just kind of, wanted to have fun. And all of a sudden that night, I was an only child. My parents were obviously in this strange, distressful, unhealthy place, a house full of people. It was, I didn't know what to do. And I didn't even know how to feel. I think I was completely numb. So I did go to the funeral. They didn't allow me to go to the burial. I'm guessing they didn't want to they didn't want me to see her lowered into the ground, but I did go to a funeral, which was an open casket funeral. And I have that vision of her wearing this blue dress with white dots inscribed in my brain. It's not a memory I like, but it's a memory that I have. And from then, it just got worse, really. I spent some time at one of my friend's house, Liz. I think my parents wanted me to not be there for the first few days. I don't think I was there for very long, but I was back, and I remember very clearly how my parents dealt with it. And it was really very alarming and distressing and very unhelpful to me. So my father, who I mentioned really probably never really liked Robin, was uncomfortable with her, embarrassed by her. The doctor told him that she was freezing just before her death. She was very cold. She had lost her body temperature. And so I'm watching this. He went out to the backyard because, it was November, end of November, so it was snowing. And he went out to the backyard and he lay in the snow to create this similar cold experience for himself. And he just lay there.
How interesting.
Like that.
Yeah. That's interesting.
And then, so, he had a lot of guilt. I was still working as he always had been. But my mother set on this focused mission to become pregnant. That's what she set out to do. And my father started coming home in the middle of the day, something that was unusual. And 5 months after Robin's death, she was pregnant. So it didn't take very long. And her focus was on that. And me, I was just basically abandoned. I suffered unbelievable guilt, really woke up with guilt, went to bed with guilt. I didn't, as I said, we weren't close. I didn't say the things I wanted to say. I didn't treat her the way I probably would have treated her in a different family. So I had unbelievable guilt. And all that pressure that was going toward Robin pivoted over to me.
I was just about to say, I was like, let's hang on, Audree. I want to pause in this moment just for a second, because I hear about this all the time now that I've started to go into this work. And I'm sure you've heard about this much longer than me because you've been in this for much longer than me. And when you've now shifted to two different positions in the family, you shifted to only child, and no one's talking to you about all these emotions that you're feeling at 12 years old, being an only child, feeling guilt and shame and all of these things because you feel like, you weren't able to talk to Robin, and you're not really understanding what's happening because now you're going to be you're going to be the oldest. Like you've taken on two different roles. That's a lot. And I'm sure a lot of people listening can understand that. Of course you felt abandoned. Of course. Nobody consulted you about these changes ever. Yeah.
And they were so busy, kind of dealing with things in their own way, which was not healthy, So I never got any therapy. I was never offered any. I don't think that's something that maybe it was as popular back then, but certainly not something that they considered doing or bringing into the family. So yeah, so I was abandoned, and I had to figure out who I was as an only child, a guilty only child. And so what happened to me is I turned from being sort of this, younger child that didn't really work that hard and kind of found, most things came pretty easy. I became a perfectionist, overachieving, and I just wanted to be perfect at everything. I kind of was almost like a switch was flipped. I became a different person. I wanted to excel at everything, and then I wanted to move as far away from them as possible. I wanted to be, I was only 12, but my goal was to be out of the house as soon as I could be, and to be able to have a lot of choices, and to have been very, very successful in everything that I did. So I became very driven. I was numb, but I was driven. And, to a large degree, if you were to look at my report cards, I went from kind of, being sort of this B person to being this A+ person pretty quick. And, to be honest, I've been that way my whole life. I've been a perfectionist and sort of very driven, striving to be the best at sort of anything and everything that, I chose to attempt. So that personality stayed with me. Wasn't a short term in any way. You talked about the term forgotten mourner, for siblings, surviving siblings, and it really is the appropriate term. I mean, the world moves on. They moved on. My mother became pregnant. My father found his way, but we don't move on. We just don't. People need to understand that the sibling relationship, it just doesn't end for us. It continues on, and it's devastating and really hurtful to act like or pretend, that it does. And that they did pretend that things were different. My brother was born 14 months after Robin's death. And, that was both good and bad. It did help deflect some of the attention from me, but all of a sudden then, I was an only child, and I mean, I'm an older child. So I went from being, as you said, the younger child to the only child to the older child. And I didn't actually know even, what that was going to be about. So some other kind of bad things happened too. My mother became estranged from her mother. She basically stopped talking to her. I mean, shortly after my brother was born, there was some kind of falling out. Again, I was, I think, 13 by then, but, I don't really exactly know. But I'm pretty sure what happened was, that my mother, who needed to be the center of attention for everything, needed my grandmother, her mother, to really pay a lot of attention to her and give her a lot of love and support. My grandmother needed the same thing from my mother. Neither one of them really were able to give each other what they each needed. And I think at some point, my mother just got frustrated and just said, okay, I'm not going to talk to you. So they really stopped talking. And, I lost my grandmother because I wasn't allowed to talk to her. I was told that if I was, or if I did talk to her, that would be disloyal on my part. So I lost my sister, and I lost my grandmother too, very shortly after my brother was born. So I really hated that. That was very, very stressful.
That's a lot. Well, that's a lot of loss. And I think you're actually telling all of my listeners, the listeners of this podcast, a tale that I'm sure a lot of them have gone through as well, because loss is not just always the loss of our sibling. We lose people, as you guys know from my story too. We sometimes lose our family members through this as well, because it's a difficult situation, and our family members don't always know how to deal with these situations appropriately, because, we're bringing awareness to this. This is you and me, Audree. We're all about bringing awareness to this, which is why we connected so well. But not everybody knows. And I have so much empathy for you on that. And it's interesting because I didn't even know we had that in common, because my mother and her mother stopped talking to each other a long time ago too. So that's a whole other podcast and episode, but I'm sure a lot of you guys can relate to this. There's a lot of family complications that happen with a sibling loss. And then when it's their child or grandchild, and, we're going to come up on that in a little while, but a lot of that can happen. So it's very interesting. And I appreciate your vulnerability in sharing that, because, wow, you went through a lot of loss, not just your sister. You also became an only child. Now you found out you're going to be the older. I mean, really, Audree, that's incredible. And I'd love for you to share with us too, before I want you to keep pressing forward because you have so much to share with us. It's just incredible. But what was it like to be the youngest, the only, and then the eldest? And which one did you prefer? I've got to ask you that question while we're here.
Well, it's almost like I was three different people.
Right.
Because, it's hard even to like bridge them all together, because my memories, and you got to remember, my parents changed a lot too. So like my mother, after my sister died, completely lost any sense of humor that she might have had, any ability to be playful. Like I kind of remember like before my sister died, like I would come home from school one day and like she'd be hiding in the closet and surprise me, like little things like that. No, all that totally stopped. And she was never playful or funny or anything at all after that. Everything was serious. So she was very different also. So I think my memories of being, the younger child was certainly easier because, again, my sister had the brunt of the spotlight and the pressure. And, oftentimes it's the older sibling that kind of opens the door. The younger sibling just walks right on through. So I'd say that was, that was easier. And I remember being kind of carefree and happy. As the only child, I was obviously suffering great loss, and I was changing. I was changing into this perfectionist driven person. I had a lot of stress. My mother hovered over me, and I wasn't used to having all this attention, so I did not like being the only child. For sure, out of the three roles, that was the one I liked least. So that's easy. Being the older child, I enjoyed having a younger brother, and it did take some of the pressure off of me, and so they were spending more time with him. But it was awkward because basically when he was born, they stopped talking about Robin. Okay, so her room was turned into a nursery. So what was her room now became my brother's room. And they stopped talking about her. And I think they didn't want him to feel in any way that he was only born to replace her, even though clearly that was true. But my mother had this story that she always wanted a third child, and maybe she did, but never said anything. But, she stopped talking about Robin. And so that was very, very difficult. Remember, I said earlier that it's so important, to keep this child, keep the sibling alive, right? The sibling relationship doesn't go anywhere, and you want to talk about your sibling and you want to remember your sibling. So, having the house change where they just stopped talking about her was very difficult.
That's a lot. I mean, that's a lot of change too. Even you having the physical change of the room, I can imagine at that age specifically must have been a sense of finality, I would imagine, to see that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was difficult. So I lost my grandmother. My grandmother, I think, as I said, my father and his sister, Aunt May, never understood Robin. My mother's mother, the grandmother that my mother stopped talking to, was a very talented musician like Robin. So they kind of bonded over that. And maybe that made it even, more difficult, for my grandmother. So I played the piano too. As I said, my sister was very talented. I wasn't nearly as talented, but, I always wanted to play the piano because Robin was so good. I remember when we were very young and, I wanted to play and I would pretend that, that I was playing, that she was playing. And I guess that is, kind of a sweet memory. Most of my memories having to do with being close to her have to do with the music, about the piano playing that we both did and about, maybe playing some duets and, she was so good and I was so envious, but so impressed by her talent. So it really is, the music, I think, is the thing that I would say, kept us as close as we could be.
That is a beautiful sister memory. And that is so a sister-like memory, right? It's like, I wanted to be like her. I was a little jealous of that, but I loved that about her, right? That's a very sister memory. I love that. That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, how did you progress? Because 12, 13 is such a pivotal time in somebody's life, especially a young woman, a young girl. That's the preteen years. So you're very impressionable. So kind of walk us through how you have now become this perfectionist, which I'm actually not surprised because our birthdays are just one day apart. So I'm not surprised. We're guilty as charged, the Virgo cuspers over here. So, but how did you progress forward? Because that's a lot of loss, a lot of change. Wow. Unpack that for us, Audree. That's a lot.
So, I mean, first of all, it was very difficult to go. My mother really did hover over me. I mean, she tried to get inside my head and understand my every last thought. And I really was trying very hard to push her away. So there was a lot of frustration in the house because I really wanted to do my own thing. I wanted to be, independent and, figure out maybe who I even was in all these different roles, where she was hovering over me and insisting that I spend time with her and asking me a lot of questions. And I remember one time I became so frustrated with her that I actually picked up a bowl of Fruit Loops that I was having for breakfast and threw it in her face. She was sitting there with the milk dripping down her face. I mean, that's how difficult it was even to live in that house, that I got that frustrated to do something like that, which I would never do and never have done since. So I think for me, I just wanted to be as busy as possible. I made myself as busy as possible. I, continued with piano lessons. I said the music was the thing that really connected me with Robin. So I held onto that really fiercely and became quite a driven pianist. And, I was at some piano competitions and was even a music major for one semester. I wasn't necessarily really that talented, but I was very hardworking, which compensated for maybe some lack of talent that I had. So I was very busy, with the music, with school, with being in these plays. I really enjoyed being in the plays. So I think I just kept myself so busy. I didn't know who I was, but, the music kept me close to Robin. The plays allowed me to be whoever I wanted to be, whoever the character was I was portraying in the play. So I really liked the plays. But I didn't know who I was. So I from 12 to, when I moved out of the house at 17, I really didn't mature. I was kind of the same at 17 as I was with 12 emotionally, because I didn't have any therapy. I kept myself busy, but I didn't really mature. I was hovered over, overprotected. So it was difficult. And, it left me in, I think, a very damaged and vulnerable condition. So that was kind of what happened during those other years. I said, the music is really important. And again, that would be another piece of advice I think I would give siblings. If you connect, to your departed sibling in a way where you shared something like the music, or some other kind of hobby or talent, I think it's really important to continue to do those things, and they'll keep your memories alive, because the music is just really important. And I can tell you that every place I've lived, I've had a piano. Even when I lived in a dorm room, I had a piano. I mean, I just never, I didn't understand back then why I needed a piano so badly. I do understand it now after, having all therapy through my adult life. But wherever I lived, I rented a piano, or I, ultimately was able to buy one. But in a dorm room, I rented an old Story and Clark piano, and then, various places I lived, apartments, I always had to have a piano. It was just something that was a given to me. And I now realize that because I needed that, because that was the connection I had to Robin. And by not having a piano, I was basically losing that connection. So that was the way I kept her alive. I have the piano music that she played before she passed away. I've kept it. I have it right now. I've kept it with me. I've moved it from house to house, and believe me, over the years, I've moved many times, and I've kept the piano music and many other artifacts that I've, moved with me. But the piano music specifically, with all the notes, from our teacher, Mrs. Heller, that was the teacher that we had when we took lessons. And I have all those piano music with all those little notes that she gave to Robin. So yeah, I would say it's really important to continue to embrace those things that you share together.
Yeah, definitely. So tell us a little bit about the actual loss of Robin, though. Did you ever find out what happened to Robin?
So I did. I mean, I have some version of what happened to Robin. I think my parents, they did have an autopsy done because they were concerned that there was something congenital that maybe we needed to know about. So there was some technical, cause of death. So what they told me, which was, really all I know, was that, she basically got sick and had a virus that landed on her heart, and it caused her heart to stop. I'm sure there's something much more medical, but that's what I was told. And, that's basically, what happened. As I said, after my brother was born, they really stopped talking about her. And it was difficult for me to have any conversations with them that included her.
Right. It was kind of like, he's here now. Let's move forward. Like, this is, it's a new year. It's a new child. Wow.
Yeah. And they were different. They were better parents with him.
Interesting.
They definitely were. They were older, as I said, my father was in his 50s and my mother was in her 40s when he was born. So I think in general, just being older, they probably had calmed down in some ways. And plus they were just different from having gone through the death of a child. Sure. But they were definitely more patient. He wasn't a special child like Robin. He was, more typical child and their first son. So they were more patient and I think in general more loving to him. And so they weren't that way to me, by the way. They were still the same to me, but they.
That was going to be my follow-up. I was like, okay, Audree, unpack that for us though, because how did the dynamic as you went through life and there was the perfectionist in you? When did you move out? What was that?
So I moved out, as soon as I could when I graduated from high school. Mm-hmm. But they were different parents. But as I said, I was so busy and I was trying not to be there very much. Sure. So I don't think I was disturbed by. I wanted them to be good parents for my brother. I mean, I loved him. He was, and I'm very close to him today. Yeah, obviously we didn't grow up together, being so far apart in age. But as adults, we've gotten close, and so I was happy they were good parents to him. And the thing is, for me, I was in this state of numbness. Of having lost my sister and then having her kind of be erased from the house. So it was very devastating. I was very insecure. I didn't have a good opinion of myself. I wasn't nice to my sister. So I kind of grew up in this sort of damaged, insecure. I mean, I compensated by being this perfectionist and very successful at many things, but that didn't change the fact that I didn't know who I was. I didn't know who I wanted to be. And those things those two things just lived together, and I just needed to get by and mm-hmm. move out. Mm-hmm. So I did graduate from high school in 1973. I moved away, but I had the maturity of a 12-year-old. And so it was going to be a disaster. And it was, it was awful. So I moved into a dorm where I had this ghetto, which was, unusual, but I didn't take care of myself. I mean, I didn't really value taking care of myself. I didn't care. I was still numb. And so I became sick. I got pneumonia and I was hospitalized and ended up having to drop out of school. So, I basically didn't take care of myself, which caused me to get sick. And I dropped out of school. I didn't know who I was. I felt unlovable, unworthy. So after that, I dropped out of school. I moved into a house with some other young people, and I took some classes. I took some nursing classes, not because I wanted to become a nurse, but I just wanted to kind of, understand myself, a lot that, I was taking nursing because I needed self-care and I needed mm-hmm. care. So I took some classes and, hopeful that somebody would care about me. And I kind of, I tried to figure out who I was, but it's very difficult to, in the state to become healthy. I had some poor, I'll say unhealthy codependent relationships, with men. I became engaged to somebody who I had absolutely had no intention of marrying, none whatsoever. But it was almost like I was stepping outside my body, watching myself portray this, this role of getting married. And then, of course, I never did because I was not ready to get married, and I don't even think I liked him. But I didn't know who I was, so I could be with somebody and just be whoever that person wanted me to be. Mm-hmm. Looking for some love, some caring, some redemption. So, it was bad. I had a very, very, very low point when I was 19. I became pregnant because I didn't really care enough to not become pregnant. And I'd say that was the lowest point. And, it set me into ultimately into a better direction because I couldn't have gotten much, much lower than that. But it was a very, very, eye-opening, situation to be in. I considered the whole thing just to be, one big disease. And I realized at that point that, I had to do something. Otherwise, I was just going to self-destruct. And I didn't want to.
Was that your moment? That was your moment of change for you? Like, I've got to do something. Yeah, that's a big moment. Yeah.
Yeah. I realized then, it couldn't get any worse. I mean, I didn't know who I was. I was on a tilt-a-whirl, right? I was just going here and there, being whoever anybody wanted me to be, hanging on. And then it couldn't continue that way. I didn't want to self-destruct, right? I wanted to be somebody. I wanted to figure out who I was. So, I realized that I needed to do something to at least start the journey toward becoming healthy and functional. So I went back to school 2 years after graduating from high school, and I started getting therapy I didn't have any money. I think I mentioned that my father didn't have any money and was always having a lifestyle that he couldn't afford. So they weren't able to help financially, but I was able to start with some therapy services through student services. When I was a student, I was able to go and start therapy. And I did that the day that I started my first class.
That's amazing. Was that like the game changer for you, was going to therapy? Or did it take some time for you to be open to it? Or were you just like all in right away?
Oh, I was all in right away. I mean, I had to get better. I mean, I couldn't continue on in this mode. It was impossible. So, and I knew the only way to get better was to get help. I wasn't able to do it myself. I had lots of time between 12 and 19, and I never got it better. So I started therapy. I have had therapy, not continuously through my whole life. I mean, it's a long time, but I have had therapy intermittently. I'm in therapy right now, but, without any counseling or support, I think I would have not been able to get better. So I can't really overemphasize how important therapy and counseling would have been for me had I gotten it at the time. I'm sure I could have avoided a lot of the trauma that I went through and difficult year, but ultimately, beginning it at 19, saved my life.
That's really powerful to anyone listening. And I agree 150%. I do. I don't think I would be sitting here today. Definitely wouldn't be doing this right now, talking to you, Audree, or any of you guys, because like therapy has been just the biggest help. I mean, I'm like speechless. I don't know how else I would have, and also connecting with others that understand, because this is something, as you had mentioned much earlier, unless you've gone through this, we are the forgotten warriors. We are the people that are forgotten about, and knowing that you're not alone is huge. And sometimes therapy is the first step in that process. But I just want to say that I find you so progressive, Audree, for your time, because there's a lot of people at 19 in that time that wouldn't have gone in with open arms to therapy. But there's a lot of people in 2022 that don't go in to therapy with open arms, right? I mean, this is real. And another thing I hear all the time too is, I went once and it didn't work for me. Well, my advice is typically, try someone else if that didn't click for you, or go a couple times and really give it a shot. But I'm just so blown away by you, and you just went all in, and I relate to you also. But what advice would you give those who kind of feel defeated after one, session, or feel like it's not for them? Like, what's your perspective? Because you just went all in, which
and believe me, I didn't have great therapists through student services. I mean, I have a really good therapist today, right?
Right.
But
the journey.
The journey. So, I think, for me, any therapy would have been okay. I didn't even think to evaluate the therapist. I was just, I just went right in. But I think if you're to go in and you feel like you don't connect to the therapist, somebody that maybe was more mature than I was at that time. I think you definitely want to give the therapist a chance. And then, get a different therapist. I mean, over the years, I've had, maybe 7 or 8 different therapists. I lived in different places and I was in different situations. Not all of them have been, as good as the one I have now, for instance. But, I think I think you have to be committed to the idea of therapy, not committed to the therapist. So if you're committed to the idea of therapy, then, you're going to find a therapist because you want to get better. And so if the first one, after, you don't want to, I don't think after one session you really know, but after a few sessions, if it really feels like, you're on different wavelengths, then find somebody else. I think, getting a recommendation from somebody that who's used a therapist is probably the best thing. I mean, the best therapists I've had have been ones that have been recommended. The one I have now, I actually took a class and she was a teacher and I just really connected with her as a teacher. So I went up to her and asked her if she had clients and she said yes. And so, I've kind of found her myself, but I've had a couple that have been recommended from people that I respected. And I think those have been the most successful. But again, you want to be committed to the therapy and then find the therapist. Okay.
I love that. Yeah, I love that. No, I don't think anybody's ever said that before. And I think, at least not to me. So I think, again, for those of you listening as surviving siblings or to anybody that is seeking advice or a counselor or therapy for the first time, you need to be committed. God, I love that, Audree. You need to be committed to the therapy. It's not always just about, I do feel like, to your point, I do feel like you need to feel a connection, but I don't think one session, unless it's just like red flags are flying right in the first session, you don't know. You need to give it a shot. Also, when you're to your point, in the numb phase, that can be a year, that can be a couple years. It depends. Everybody's different. Sometimes you don't know. You have to be committed to the therapy. Oh, Audree, I'm using that. That is like in my tool belt now. I love that. Well, once you committed to the therapy, you obviously came out on the other side as a surviving sibling, as I kind of like to call it. And, we've talked about this before just in our connection that, we don't believe in moving on. We move forward. This is with us for life. And it sounds like this was your point of moving forward, learning to move forward truly and getting these tools to move forward. So and then you became a mother.
So I did. And so it took me a very long time. I mean, it's obviously always a work in progress. Like you're never there. You're always getting there. So I went back to school. I was, again, very driven and perfectionist. So I, was successful and I got a degree in math and a master's degree in computer science. I've had a lot of, professional success. I married pretty young, and I think I wasn't ready to be married, clearly, but I married young because I really desperately wanted children and to create a healthy family. Coming from the family that I had, I really felt empty when it came to families. I wanted to be the mother that my mother could never be. I wanted to be that mother who would have been good for Robin. I wanted to be that mother who would have been good for me. So, I prioritized finding a partner using criteria that, was kind of unusual. So I wanted somebody that was willing to have children fairly quickly and somebody that would give me a lot of space. I mean, I clearly didn't know who I was. I needed a lot of space. I couldn't have any pressure, to be something or, that I didn't even know who I was myself. And so I chose a partner that checked those 2 boxes. I was a crappy partner and spouse. I'll admit I wasn't very good because at that time I didn't know who I was. I still felt unlovable. I ended up really not being a good partner. I was vulnerable. I wasn't faithful. And so, I did it. And I know why I did it, because I had that powerful need to be a mother and to have a healthy family. But clearly it would have been healthier and kinder to people in my orbit if I had waited until I knew myself better. But I didn't. And so I plowed forward and I continued to work. And I was a pretty driven workaholic for many years, continuing to strive for perfection. And I had a lot of success, a lot of professional success. And that helped me to feel better about myself. Professional success always does. But it really was never enough to fill that big empty hole I had in my heart. So I did end up, divorcing after about 19 years of marriage. I remarried, and of course, by then I knew myself a lot better and made a much better choice, and very happily married. I obviously got married to have children, so I wanted children right away. I hated my stint as an only child. As I said, out of all three roles, that was the one I liked least. So I never would have considered ever having just one child. And I never considered being childless. So I had two children, 21 months apart. So my first child was a daughter, and I named her after Robin, and her name is Audree Robin. So I made the Robin the middle name. And I did that very, very deliberately. I always planned to do that. I wanted Robin to be remembered. My parents blotted out her memory after my brother was born, and that was very, very difficult for me. I wanted her to be remembered, and having Bree have her name, was sweet. I loved it. And, it made me even feel close to Robin in addition to the music. So, as a small sidebar, about 10 years ago, I went to my 40th high school reunion. My 50th is next year. And a woman that I was in a play with, she was actually in that Oklahoma play, but we were in many other plays also.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Her name was Maxine, which is my mother's name. But in that play and a couple other plays, she came up to me and she talked about Robin, remembering Robin. And, nobody had mentioned Robin in years. I mean, I don't live in the same state and I don't have any of the same, friends that I had when I was in high school. But it was just such a great experience. I mean, I just was so overwhelmed and delighted that she actually remembered and came up to me and initiated this conversation. That it just was great. She remembered Robin after all these years. So it was, really a moment. So, I would say for other people, other surviving siblings, that it is really healthy and affirming to remember, to talk about, to delight in and honor your departed sibling. They don't go away. We do go forward, but they're with us. So if people were to ask me, and I know you've talked about this, Maya, in your podcast, how many siblings I have, I answer that I have two siblings, but only one is still living. I don't say I just have one, because it's not true.
I think that's a powerful thing, because I think when you first lose your sibling, and even years after, you still are confused about how to answer that question. So I love that you just brought that up, Audree. Like, it's a difficult one. And I also think, it's your choice, however you want to address that question. But I'm just like you, Audree. I always say I'm the oldest of four. And if people ask me, oh, what's the breakdown? Tell me the breakdown. I always say I have two sisters and I have a brother who has passed away. And that's it. And that's the conversation. And, the reaction sometimes is, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Sometimes, in my opinion, I think the reaction is a little inappropriate sometimes when I don't know that person very well and they want to find out a little bit more. And, I'm to a point now where I've shared my story with the world. So I don't feel that way as much anymore. But in the beginning, I was like, gosh, they want to know a lot. And then when they hear it was a homicide, aka murder, they feel a little different, right? So it's, but we evolve as life moves on. And so I really love that you brought that up, Audree. I think I think it's interesting that you were so different in your youth because you're so raw and vulnerable, and the work that you're doing with sibsforever.org, which we're going to talk about even more. Guys, this is just part one with Audree. We're going to talk about part two, so much more in part two, because she has a part two to her story and has gone through sibling loss again. And we're going to talk about that on part two. But before we leave part one, I want you to answer the question I ask all of the guests here on the Surviving Siblings podcast. You've given so much advice, Audree. What is maybe some advice we skipped over or forgot to mention that you'd give to these incredible listeners as a surviving sibling? Because in part two, we're going to get your advice and your story as a grandmother whose daughter has lost a child. And so your granddaughter is a surviving sibling now. So stay tuned for that. We're going to be talking about her grandson who she lost. But right now, I want to hear your advice as a surviving sibling.
So, a lot of it I shared, as we went along. I'd say the most important thing is to get healthy yourself. And, for me, that turned out to be, therapy. I think, everybody that's in this situation probably needs some help. If you don't have a family, that maybe can offer all the help, need some outside help, but, really embrace the help. And, your sibling is a piece of you, right? You grew up together, In some cases, you're best friends. In some cases, maybe you're not, but, you're connected. You've got the same parents. You grew up in the same environment. Nobody knows you like your sibling does. And so you want to continue that. You want to still feel close to your sibling, continue the things that maybe you did together and really, hold on to the memories. You won't, you'll move forward with your life. You have to, you don't want to become frozen, but you want to take with you this relationship and everything that it brought for you. So, keep it alive. That is the purpose of sibsforever.org. As you said, we'll talk about later is, to help keep those memories and precious moments and stories alive, because they're so important, and they're so much a part of who you are.
Beautifully said, Audree. Well, Audree, thank you so much for part 1 and sharing your perspective as a surviving sibling. On part 2, you're going to share your perspective as a grandmother. So thank you so much for being here today. Thank you so much for listening to the Surviving Siblings podcast. If you enjoyed this episode as much as I did creating it for you, then share it on your chosen social media platform. And don't forget to tag us at Surviving Siblings Podcast so that more surviving siblings can find us. Remember to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. And don't forget to follow us on all social media platforms. We're on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok at Surviving Siblings Podcast. All links can be found in the show notes, so be sure to check those out too. Thank you again for the support. Until the next episode, keep on surviving, my surviving siblings.